evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions. The chairman of The Spectator, broadcaster and journalist Andrew Neil. South African author, now living in Perth, Sisonke Msimang. People's panellist, Elena Jeffcoat, who teaches maths and debating in Perth. Feminist trailblazer Germaine Greer, whose new book on rape argues for a rethink of the laws around consent. And celebrated essayist David Marr. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. Well, if the Liberal Party thought it had a gender problem after losing Deputy Julie Bishop and the bullying allegations, it just got worse today. Liberal backbencher Anne Soudmalis has announced she won't recontest her marginal seat. Calls for quotas are spreading, and our first question comes from Sharad Sahu.
Thank you, Tony. Any form of discrimination is quite appalling, be it due to race, gender or status. I am 200% against any form of discrimination. But do you think that justifies us in moving away from society of merits to society of quotas? I would like to ask a question by way of analogy. If you, in case if you are having any critical surgery performed on yourself, would you like to have it performed by a doctor if you knew he or she has got her degree based on quota and not on merits?
OK, we'll start with the women on the panel. Sisonke, what do you think?
It's great to start with an easy question. So I think that it's a false dichotomy, this idea that somehow if you get an opportunity due to a quota system or affirmative action, that therefore you're not worthy of that opportunity. So I'm a proud beneficiary of affirmative action, and what I'm clear on is I wouldn't have gotten a second look had it not been for affirmative action. And often I've gotten jobs because affirmative action allowed someone to see me, whereas they would have dismissed me before, and I was certainly the best candidate for the job.
So quotas in politics you think might work, quotas in the Liberal Party to get more women into Parliament?
I mean, I feel like I'm not going to hold my breath waiting for the Liberal Party to adopt quotas, certainly not around women. But I think quotas work. I think they change the institutional environment. I think they have immediate impact. I mean, if we look at the Australian Stock Exchange, at board level, they made a decision in 2010. It was 8% of women were on boards, and within a couple of years, we've shot up to 26%. So an immediate increase, an immediate change in the sort of beginning to see a change in the environment. So I think quotas work. I think they make a difference, and I think it's false to pit merit against quota systems. I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Elena, what do you think?
Sharad, I think that the example that you've chosen is an interesting one because I would argue that the skill level required to be a surgeon is substantially higher than the skill level required to be a politician. And so, you know, I do understand what you're saying. I think ideally we would have a gender balance in all industries, but I think first and foremost we should address that in that industry of politics. You know, what are the skill requirements to be in politics? You have to speak well, you have to be able to think clearly, you know, and...
So what happened?
Yeah, OK. And, you know, what is your fundamental responsibility? You're there to represent. You're supposed to be representative. That's it. That's the reason for which the industry exists. So if it's like that phrase, you had one job. You had one job to represent the Australian population, which we know has been, always will be, 50% male, 50% female. How can you be truly representative if that's your only role if you are not made up of 50% males and 50% females? So I do take your point with regards to surgeons, and I understand, of course, we would all want to be in the best hands with surgery. Let's just get politics right first. Let's get that 50-50 and then we'll see where things go.
So quotas, yes.
In politics, 100%, yes.
Germaine.
Now, there's a number of complicated issues here. The British tried this. In 1997, we had 101 women elected to the House of Representatives, it would be, the Commons, good word, that. We had 101 women elected who were Blair's babes. And as far as I can see, I did quite a lot of work on these women because they had a dreadful time. They weren't helped by their male colleagues. They were allowed to collapse in Prime Minister's questions. They got things wrong. They were sneered at. They were told that the timetable of the Commons would be changed, so it was more family-friendly. It wasn't. It was still a bear pit. And they were humiliated, and the whole thing was in some ways a disaster. It had already been made illegal in 1996 to have all
Germaine,
women
doesn't that actually sort of make the case that the more women you have in Parliament, the less likely you are to have the kind of bullying that we've seen in our own Parliament here in Australia?
I'm not sure that that is what it tells you, because the women had no idea, really, what was likely to be they were likely to be up against. But there's another thing that nobody notices. Politicians need wives. Do you notice that? If you're a woman politician, you are a wife. But the way that our system runs is that our politicians use their wives for everything, for raising the family, for keeping the show on the road. I seem to remember something called the Winter Ball last week. It was outrageous. I mean, here were all these politicians with suddenly these peacock women in terribly expensive clothes, and that was all part of the jockeying for status in the situation that they were in. I think we have to understand something here, that women politicians need wives too.
So, just a very brief one, no to quotas.
Well, what's happened since in England?
No, I mean a brief one.
We got 101 women who won seats in 1997. By 2010, most of them were gone.
OK, David Marr.
Well, I think looked at coolly, objectively, if that's what merit has reduced the Liberal Party to, they should try quotas. They really should. And the sooner the better. The great puzzle of the Liberal Party at the moment, and has been for some time, is what country does it think it's representing? And it is not a country of mad racists. It is not a country which is 75% male. I think it's only about 22, 24% of women as members of Parliament in the Liberal caucus. What country do they think they are representing? The Labor Party found it very painful to move to a not entirely concrete quota system, but the result has been for that party a great advantage in politics. And oddly enough, advantage counts.
Andrew, in Britain, Germaine pointed out some of the history, but the Labor Party actually does have an affirmative action system where certain seats only women can apply. The shortlist is made up entirely of women. Now, is that the sort of thing that could work? It hasn't actually worked for the Tories, obviously, because...
Well, they've not tried it.
1% of the Tory MPs are women.
I think as a general proposition, every democratic parliament in the world needs more women. They're not enough. And I think that is particularly true of Australia, where you have fallen way behind the democratic average. 20, 25 years ago, Australia, there weren't many women, but you actually had more than most parliaments. Now you are, I think, out of 50, down in the late 30s or early 40s. You're among the worst. And that's not healthy, that's not representative, and you're also not tapping in to a huge chunk of the population, which would increase the overall brain power of your parliament. The more people you have to choose from, the better that parliament's likely to be. The question is, how do you do it? And I think it's better if you could do it without quotas, if it could just happen naturally. I understand that. The problem is if you leave it just to happen naturally, it can take forever. And not just me or Germaine, but almost everybody around this table would be gone before naturally it got to 50-50. So what happened in Britain was not as Germaine described it. What happened was that the Labour Party went through a period of all-women shortlists, not quotas, but a way of getting more women in Parliament. Yeah. It was subsequently declared illegal on equality grounds, but it broke the logjam It got a number of women in. And of course, all that 100 are not still there. But here's the difference, Germaine. You look on the Labour side now, it's full of women. It's not unusual that women are there. It's just natural part of the democratic process. And although the Tories didn't go for quotas or even shortlists, they've had to go for more and more women. Of course, they can boast that they've had 2 female prime ministers. Labour's had none. So you need to do something. If you can't get there naturally, you need, if not to go for long-term quotas, to get something that breaks the logjam and something that makes having women 50-50 in your politics just the natural order of things.
OK, you're watching Q&A. Later we hope to discuss rape and consent, drug laws and that cartoon. Let's stick with politics for now. Our next question comes from Cora Ingram.
Thank you. As a very young woman, I read The Female Eunuch and it set a pattern for my life. In light of recent political events in federal parliament, where female members have been told to toughen up and not be sooks, and after years in the public service seeing young women rewarded for bullying and intimidation, where are we now in terms of feminism and equality? Must women behave like men in order to achieve?
Germaine, we'll start with you. Keep our answers brief if we can, because we've got a lot of questions to go through. I don't just mean you, by the way.
Do women need to behave like men in order to succeed? I mean, the difficulty about what Parliament is that it's been for however long a man's club. And when we look at the corporate world, we realise that boys start thinking in corporate terms when they're still quite small. They have leaders, they have competitors, they have step and fetch-its, they have people who make them laugh, and they work their way up in this corporate form. And for women, it's really foreign. They really don't get it, and they don't understand how you play that game. If I look at Angela Merkel, I have to look elsewhere to see. Now, Merkel was groomed, Merkel was taught how to sail a narrow channel and avoid annoying too many people. But the women who found themselves in Parliament in 1997 really hadn't a clue. I mean, they didn't even know how to ask questions at question time. And they were humiliated. And then it turned out they were quite good at fiddling the expenses. At this point, you wanted to give up. You wanted to say you're going to be on the losing end everywhere.
You're over your minute. I'm going to go to David Marr. David, tell us, what's Scott Morrison going to do here? Because he's losing women on an almost daily basis at the moment. How can he contain these bullying allegations?
Well, some things are absolutely inevitable, Tony, and that is that the latest woman member of Parliament who looks like she won't be standing at the next election is being ousted by a local real estate agent. And that's in the highest traditions of the Liberal Party to get as many real estate agents as possible into Parliament. So you've got to weigh these things up, mate, because
there is a quota, David.
Yes, of real estate agents, probably there is. I don't see why women should give away their natural advantage by pretending to be men to get on. I really don't. I live in a world of powerful, successful, and frequently frightening women, and I've just watched them be wonderful at their jobs and get there. And I just don't see any kind of notion of pretending to be men as a way ahead, be women.
Sisonke.
Yeah, look, I think this is another one where the Australian Parliament is out of step with reality. So I think in real life, women are doing all kinds of interesting things and are beginning to shape institutions in ways that reflect the diversity of what women are. So, rather than have any kind of natural, caring, nurturing sense, we're just diverse. So some of us are really nice and some of us are actually awful. And I think that's the kind of society we want to be able to begin to build, one that recognizes a kind of diversity of who women are. And unfortunately, I think the Australian Parliament hasn't yet fully accounted for that diversity. So if you're looking for hope, I don't think the Australian Parliament is a place to look for it. But I do think that there are other spaces to look for hope. And I think that if I think about, some fascinating conversations I've had with young women, there's a fantastic young women's boxing club that exists in Perth. And what they do is they meet to talk about what's bugging them, what's happening. And the strategies that they're developing for challenging sexism in their own lives are fascinating. And one of the things they do is that when someone makes a sexist or a racist joke, often boys who are their age, which surprises me, but I don't know boys that age anymore, they challenge them by asking, like, what's funny about that? Right? So you take the sting out of the joke. This is very useful for the cartoonists among us. You take the sting out of the joke by saying, like, what's funny? Can you explain to me why that's funny? I don't get it. Right? Ordinary ways that young people are challenging sexism. So I think don't look in Parliament.
Elena, looking into Parliament, the Liberal women are kicking back. Kelly O'Dwyer tonight has called for an independent inquiry into the bullying allegations, and the heart of that question was about the bullying. Would it shock you to see what was going on?
Yeah, I actually was going to ask you to repeat the last part of your question. Was it about bullying and intimidation? I'm sorry.
And after years in the public service seeing young women rewarded for bullying and intimidation, where are we now in terms of feminism and equality? Must women behave like men in order to achieve?
Right, so I don't think bullying and intimidation have any place in any workplace. That's it, end of story. And like Sisonke just said that some women are lovely and some of us are awful, well, like, okay, accepted. But I mean, I think we should be aiming for a world in which none of us are awful. And I'm a full-time high school teacher, so I think I'm an educator. My job is to teach children not just how to do math, but how to grow up and be a civilised human being. And that means not bullying others and not speaking to others rudely and not throwing your weight around and not ever thinking that violence is acceptable. Like, we're civilised. We live in a civilised society. We're better than that. All of our workplaces, should have a standard of behaviour. I know mine does. The school that I work in is a wonderful place and people are kind to each other. I don't understand why that can't be replicated. And when you say, should women have to take on men's characteristics, I don't want to demonise men as well, because not all men are like that. We were talking about wonderful women. Most of the men I know are wonderful, kind people, and they can manage to behave on that level that they need to at standard workplace culture. So it seems to be we've got this minority group of particularly toxic men in Parliament, and that seems to be a common theme.
Andrew, toxic men in Parliament, you'd be familiar with that in Britain, obviously. But
it's my full-time job to cover them. And some toxic women as well. It cuts both ways. Bullying, as you say, is a terrible thing. And it's not just men on women. Men can be bullied too, men by men, women by men, sometimes women by women, and sometimes women on men. That happens all over. Now, in this particular case, I don't understand it. Because as I read it, there's a group of Liberal MPs, female MPs, who are claiming that there's basically a systemic culture of bullying in their party. And yet they've provided no evidence. I'm not saying the evidence doesn't exist, but they've provided no evidence.
Well, they've provided it privately to the party, which is dealing with it internally.
Yeah, well, that's
now sort of unravelling because what
But bullying's too important to be done with internally. As I understand it, there are mechanisms in the Australian Parliament that can deal with this. If it's bad enough, there are the criminal courts that can deal with this. And if it is as bad as the women claim, and it's not for me to doubt it at all, they shouldn't just be presenting the evidence. They should be naming names. I saw somebody today saying, oh, you don't have to name names. You do. The MeToo movement never got off the ground till it named names. And it's when you name and shame and challenge people and say this is how badly they behaved, either the Parliament deals with it or the courts and the police deal with it, nothing will change if you just keep it behind closed doors. They need to stand up now and name names.
Good point to move on. Next question is from Diana Patani.
Yes. It's mainly for Germaine, I guess. Having a conversation is better than not having one at all. However, you say that, and I quote, most rapes don't involve any injury at all. Are you saying that being violated physically doesn't come with any mental anguish? Anguish that can scar a woman, a man, a girl, or a boy for life?
Germaine.
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm trying to get people to understand is that on the one end of the spectrum, you have criminal rape. The rapes that result in convictions in the criminal courts are usually by strangers. They are usually violent and surprising. But in fact, the whole spectrum goes a great deal further, and we've got to take that on board. Now, one reason why I wrote my little essay, I've been writing on rape all my life, but one reason why I wrote it is that there's a thing happening called the Istanbul Convention. And the point of the Istanbul Convention is to try and get some sense of the law across the globe, really. It's a global question. How can we make the law of sexual assault coherent when, in fact, they're strikingly different? If we're in Belgium, for example, we can be parties to the trial in a criminal rape case. If we're in Southern Ireland, we're going to be in a closed court with anonymity for both parties, the accused and the accuser, and so on. And somehow this has got to be sorted out because we're not getting anywhere. We're getting ridiculous results. We're getting 4 young men in Belfast who abused a girl horribly, being acquitted of all charges, and Irish sports writers saying they hadn't got a stain on their conscience.
Germaine, I'm just going to go back to our questioner because she's obviously got that quote from somewhere. And I must say that I've seen a lot in the press about you suggesting that rape does not involve injury. So just go back to the questioner. Are you saying from what you've read that that's your interpretation?
Yeah, that was...
Except, look, what the police will tell you is that most rape complaints don't involve injury. Most rapists are known to the people who make the complaint, but the people who make the complaint get nowhere. I'm not saying that it's not damaging. I was raped at 19, and actually, because I'm an idiot, I was actually sorrier for the man who raped me than I was for myself, because I thought, what's happened to his sexuality? Why has he turned into this mad dog? They'll shoot him, they'll kill him, they'll wipe him out. I don't know what happened to him.
Are you saying it didn't traumatise you, though? That's, I guess, because that goes to the heart of what the question is asking.
Well, trauma is something that is dictated, really, by the sufferer. You know, I can't bear huntsman spiders. It's not their fault. It's my fault. I'm decided to be frightened of them. Now, it's interesting to me that women are encouraged all the time to be terribly, terribly frightened, and nearly always of the wrong thing.
OK, Germaine, I'm going to bring in the other women. Sisonke, what do you think?
So, having read the Germaine's essay, which I really enjoyed and surprised myself in enjoying it because I had read the media around it and had seen some of her sort of more off-the-cuff comments, so I fully expected not to enjoy it, and I did. And part of why I enjoyed it was because I think it offers us a really complicated way to think about rape, and it requires time and energy into thinking about it, which is kind of anathema to the media. And one of the things that I think is important in there, I'm trying to find Diana again. Yeah,
she's up there.
One of the things I think is important in that idea is not that rape doesn't involve injury, because it clearly involves loads of injury, mental and sometimes physical, but that what Germaine, I think, asks us to grapple with is what do we do when the people who rape us are people who we know and love? This is a very complicated question, one that requires us to think about it, because the vast majority of rape happens by people who know and love us against us. What do we do there? In that situation, I think it's a question that doesn't yet have an answer, but requires us to think not in sound bites, not in quick little snappy tweets, but actually to have real, measured, thoughtful, and very difficult conversations with one another.
Elena.
Well, first of all, I don't know how I feel about the huntsman spider analogy for rape and the trauma involved there. But look, I'm not a rape survivor or victim, so on the one hand, I feel like I'm not even qualified to speak about this. But then again, I do agree with Sisonke. This is just an immeasurably complex issue. You know, the whole field of consent. Like, I've also read Germaine's book. You know, consent is almost an indefinable thing, and Germaine made some very salient points about, you know, the fact that on college campuses you've got a lot of young people who are at that stage in their life where they are exploring their own sexuality, their own identity, what they're okay with and aren't, and so, you know, how they don't even know from moment to moment necessarily what they are okay with, and therefore whether they do give consent. So this is just incredibly complex. one of the things that I took away from reading Germaine's book is that I think as women of, different generations, and I owe a lot to Germaine, I think my generation owes a lot to Germaine, but I think we have slightly different priorities, maybe, with regards to rape and women who are raped. So last year, Germaine made comments about child brides in India and the fact that, they don't have to have sexual intercourse with their husbands necessarily. The mother-in-law will determine when they're ready for that. But now in her book, she's discussing the fact that she's very concerned with women who are in long-term stable marriages, who are having unwanted sex, and so I'm kind of thinking, hold on, what are our priorities here? Like, I'm more concerned about, I would consider that to be rape of child brides. Any child bride has not given consent. You are a child. You cannot give consent. And you have, you're trapped in a marriage with someone 2 or 3 times older than you. That is the rape we should be concerned with. Not so much baby boomer wives who, by Germaine's own admission, are happy in the lives that they've chosen and do not seek to end those marriages.
Well, let's just bring Germaine back in on that. I mean, one of the points you're making in the book is that bad marriages and bad sex quite often equals rape. That seems to be, and you're basically saying there's almost an epidemic of rape within marriages.
I can see why this annoys you, but
I'm not saying it annoys me. I'm just
here am I talking about.
That's one of your points.
I'm still trying to talk about the Istanbul Convention, because if you don't like what it says, you better start paying attention, because it could become part of the legal structure in your societies, wherever you are. Now, what has been said in the text that is written for the Istanbul Convention, which was partly written by the British, who have refused to ratify it, which is typical. We're used to them, and when it comes to this kind of thing. But what it says is non-consensual sex is rape. Now, if you're asleep, you can't give consent. If you're drunk, you can't give consent. If you're being terrorised, you can't give consent. If your husband won't speak to you for a week unless you spread your legs, you can't give consent. You can only give in. Now, I don't know what the figures are there. I only know that nobody goes there. If you read the things that women say online about sex within their marriages, you realise these women are being systematically raped, and they have never protested. Now, we've either got to start men thinking that women are not things, that women are not things they can play with when they feel like it, that sex is as hard as conversation, and most of us have no conversation at all on this issue. Now, this is serious, and that's why I wrote this little essay.
OK, Germaine, let's hear from the men, and I'll start with David, legally trained, as you are, and a man.
Violence is not, and I don't think for a very, 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 very long time, a key element of rape. I mean, rape is, in our law, sexual intercourse without consent or digital penetration or various other forms of penetration. Now, your essay is only about digital penetration. So
no, it isn't. It's only about penile penetration.
I'm sorry.
The vagina is not a hole like any other, is the general idea.
Yeah, I got that.
Direct quote.
I got that quite a long time ago. But so what you're talking about, the Istanbul Convention, and let me tell you, Australia is not going to be influenced by the Istanbul Convention. We're not influenced by refugee conventions. We're not influenced by human rights conventions. We're not going to be interested much in the Istanbul Convention.
Let's go back to consent, though, David.
Yes, and at the heart, as you say beautifully in the essay, at the heart of rape is the question of consent, and the question of determining whether the raper knew or ought to have known that he did not have consent. This has always been astonishingly difficult to prove in law. And I looked at some statistics today, and Australia, like most other countries, civilised countries, less than 10% of crimes that are complained of to the authorities end up with a conviction. And everywhere there are these appalling difficulties. And I read the essay as an eloquent work of despair, because everywhere you explore in the essay, you come up against a brick wall or a failed initiative or an old problem. And I came to the end of the essay not agreeing with you on many things, but thinking that, you know, if you want to know what the challenges are in this area, this is not a bad place to start to read them.
Andrew, do you want to jump into these murky waters?
Not really. What I'd like to ask Germaine, though, where's the evidence, where's the data for rape within marriage or long-term partnerships? What's the evidence that that is as common as you're saying it is?
None. We've never asked. There's
So
no
you're
evidence at all.
asserting something, but you don't have the evidence.
It's not true in my marriage. I just read it and just went, Germaine, I think you're speaking for an older generation. Like,
It's because we're too old to fuck. Is that
Look, can I just say, Tony, I think my generation has benefited hugely from, you know, your earlier works, and I just think it's wrong to characterise our marriages, the marriages of, you know, people of my generation, as being ones where the women are submissive and powerless, and I take offence to that.
But I haven't actually done that. But what I've said is that we don't know if consent is the issue. And I gave some cases, which are actual cases I know about. That's my evidence. So I took the case of one...
But you're an academic. You know that anecdote is not data.
Yeah, but we don't
and I'm not
have any
denying,
data.
I'm not saying
The reason we don't have...
you're wrong. I just don't know. I tend to be, I know it's unfashionable these days, but I tend to be fact-driven and data-driven before I come to conclusions about things. I know I'll never catch on, but I plough a lonely furrow nevertheless. And I'm just...
An awful lot of opinion in The Spectator, I'll just note that.
And if you want to speak about the opinion of The Spectator, you should ask the editor of The Spectator.
Yeah, true.
Because that's his job, not mine. And that's my opinion.
Nicely said.
But I just think, you know, I think it's a really interesting concept, and I'm sure that in a number of relationships, of married couples or long-term partnerships, that there is what would amount to rape in a number of cases. That seems to me just to be common sense. But what I'm trying to get to is, what is the scale of it? How omnipresent is it? How big is the problem is really
Just
Hang on for 1 second, Germaine. I just want to hear from Sisonke.
So the metric that I'm familiar with doesn't look at marriage, but it looks at the fact that we know that the majority of sexual violence in relationship, the majority of sexual violence in the Australian Human Rights Commission has a stat that says in the last 12 months, 74% of women who report that they have been victims of sexual violence, it was somebody that they knew.
Yes.
Okay? So that begins to give us a proxy.
That doesn't surprise me.
Right? And it gives us a proxy that it's not their, like, best friend. Like, if it's someone that they knew, it's likely to be their male partner, right? So we have some metrics that begin to point us in the direction that Germaine is writing about. And I will say that that I'm not convinced that there's a generational issue here. So obviously, I think things are getting better, but but it's very clear that the terrain that Germaine is talking about is really complicated. And what she's talking about is the fact that the word rape doesn't even enter the conversation, right? So that what people are doing won't even be named as rape because there's an expectation of a certain kind of sex. And I think that's a really important conversation.
Well, just before we leave this topic, let's go to one last question for Germaine. It's on the subject from Jessica Finch.
Germaine, in recent times, your stance on rape laws and consent, as well as the MeToo movement, can be seen to not represent modern feminism. Do you still identify with feminism, and if so, how do you do so whilst holding these views?
Well, wait a minute here. What are my views supposed to be? I mean, my position with the MeToo movement, everyone thinks it's changed everything, that it's all going to be fine now, that we're going to get the people who have been cruel to us and so on. And I think that's a mistake. It's not going to happen. At the moment, the police are following 2 cases against Harvey Weinstein, neither of which uses anybody from the MeToo movement, because the MeToo movement could not possibly win the case for them. because of the position that they have taken. But there's also other questions, like I'm old, I'm 80. Now, where I come from, if you go to your boss and say, I know what you've been doing to Miss Phipps in the typing pool, and I'm going to tell the local newspaper, and he says, well, hang on, I'll give you £165,000 to not do that. Where I come from, that's called blackmail. It's not called non-disclosure agreement. And as far as I'm concerned, the people involved in this are already complicit in something unpleasant.
That's a minute, and I'm just going to ask you just to come to the quick question that was asked at the end. Do you still regard yourself, do you still identify with feminism?
I couldn't be anything else. What else would I be? I can be rejected. You know, old women are used to being rejected. It happens to us every day. Reject away. I'm where I've always been, in business at the old stand.
Well said. Now, remember, if you hear... I'm not saying that was a doubtful claim, but remember, if you hear any on Q&A, let us know on Twitter and keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes from Tony Moore.
Neoliberalism is nothing new. It was an economic revolution in the 1980s, a cross-party love affair with the markets in the 1990s, and now it's a old and tired orthodoxy resented by working and middle-class people who feel like they're going backwards. Has the failure of the neoliberal experiment pushed voters to the extremes of Brexit, Trump, right-wing populism, and in Australia undermined the legitimacy of several prime ministers? And if so, what comes after neoliberalism?
Andrew Neil.
Neoliberalism, of course, is a loaded word. I think what you mean is the market economy. Australia is a market economy, and you haven't been pushed to extremes at all. Your two mainstream centre-right and centre-left parties still get the lion's share of the vote. So I don't think you've had 27 years without a recession. It's a world record. It's your market economy. Seems to be doing pretty well. You've got low unemployment. Your national debt is among the lowest of any major economy in the world. Your government deficit is among the lowest, and you've had this growth. You've got wage stagnation. That is a problem. And that's been made worse by the rise in energy prices too. So I understand that. I think that what has happened elsewhere is that the great crash of 2008 has had a slow burn. And by and large, the people who caused that crash are at least as rich, if not richer than ever. And the people who did not cause that crash, mainly the ordinary workers, have had this wage stagnation for the past 10 years, if not longer.
That's the Steve Bannon argument in the United States, obviously, that the elites who caused the crash have benefited from it, and you poor workers haven't, so vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I didn't know that was Steve Bannon's line. It will make me think twice about it. But actually, even he, Mike, like a clock, that's stopped, can be right every now and then. And I think that's had a huge impact. And it's been a slow burn. See, I think to begin with, after the crash, people thought, yeah, this has been a big crash. You didn't see it so much in Australia because your banks didn't behave as badly as the British or the European or the American banks. And they thought, yeah, we are going to have to tighten our belts a little bit. It's going to take a while to get things right. But 10 years on, they're still having to do that. And they see that those that cause things are still doing well, if not better than ever. And they don't think either the mainstream centre-left or centre-right parties have the answer. So certainly in America, they went for Trump, and that allowed a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. In France, although she didn't win, a third of French voters voted for Marine Le Pen, who is on the far right. In Italy, they now form the government of populist left and the populist right. Populist far left, populist far right, all in one government. What could possibly go wrong? After all, it is Italy. Even Sweden, where my wife comes from, which I've always regarded as being sensible, progressive, moderate, centre-left country, the hard right got almost 20% of the vote.
And you've left out Britain, you got Brexit, and what could possibly go wrong?
But Brexit, well, that's another issue. I'm happy to talk about that, but I don't think you've got enough time tonight or even tomorrow night. But the interesting thing in Brexit is that the two main parties still dominate. Brexit was undoubtedly an anti-establishment vote. It takes different forms, but throughout Europe, it has undoubtedly resulted in the demise of mainstream parties and a new danger in our democracies.
Sisonke, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I agree with that analysis. I think, however, what it doesn't take into account is the culture wars, is the fact that what we see simultaneously with the new economic realities is that there's a scapegoat. And so at the same time, you've had this moment of, you know, of migrants, of new people coming into these, you know, previously wealthy economies, and in Australia's case, continuing to be wealthy, and yet you have this backlash, this xenophobic backlash that doesn't actually match what's happening. I think it's an interesting non-coincidence. And so that's what worries me. I think
Are you saying the populist economic argument, sort of Trojan horse for racism? Is that what you're saying?
Thank you for saying it that way, because it's hard for a black woman to say that. So thank you, Tony. I was trying to skip around it. Yeah, actually.
It was a question, but anyway. David, what do you think?
Andrew makes a good point about Australia having weathered the shock of the GFC so much better than many other countries. And yes, unemployment was not terrible here, and yes, people didn't lose their houses and things. But it's what you kind of forget is how much of our politics is imported from abroad, and in particular, the never-ending culture wars from North America, the purpose of which are to smear the left in order that left pleas for money to do good things will appear ridiculous, and will to disarm the fundamental argument of the right, which is cut taxes, cut taxes, cut taxes, cut taxes, make me richer, make me richer, make me richer. And the culture wars have invaded this country, and the culture wars are intimately involved with race, intimately all the time involved with race. And the pursuit in this country, again, almost perpetually, are for the votes on the very far right of our policies, of our politics, are continually distorting the direction of national politics in this country. And together, yes, we should be in a much happier place than we are, but we're not. And that's so much because we've imported these political struggles, this political language into this country, and we're fighting fights here that we really don't have to fight.
Let's go to another question on race. This one's from Msimang, and we'll hear from the other panellists.
Mark Knight has claimed that his cartoon of Serena Williams was not racist because he was unaware of historical racism, specifically that elements of the cartoon resembled the type of monkey features depicted in the cartoons of African American people in the Jim Crow law era. What do you think can be done about people who claim racism, who claim ignorance as a justification for racism?
I'll start with Elena. What do you think about this?
Not good enough. That's not good enough. He's a professional cartoonist. If I rocked up to work and said I didn't know, how to teach my students math, or I didn't know how to mark, that's his profession, and he's been at it for a while, I believe. So yeah, completely just nonsense. I just think as a white person, I have no right to say whether something is or isn't racist. I've come to that conclusion now after thinking about this for a while. I have no idea in my lifetime how many times, someone has smiled at me or held a door open for me or, picked something off of the ground when I've dropped it, just everything because of the colour of my skin. I can't rerun that experiment. I can't go back through my life and live all the same experiences with differently coloured skin and see how it would have been different. So I just think white people can never understand really whether we are or aren't racist.
You could call it out when you see it, though.
Oh, definitely. And I think that cartoon was racist. But I think any white person who's sitting there going, well, I don't think it is, and I don't understand why it is, just needs to shut up.
Let me hear
because if black people say it's racist, then it's racist.
Let's hear from Sisonke on the cartoon.
So I think that this idea, it's been fascinating listening to this idea of the sort of the Jim Crow cartoons. There's this ignorance is a way of pretending innocence. And I think there's a lot of fake innocent people who are wandering around this world when it comes to questions of race. And so the invoking the Jim Crow idea is a sort of way of saying, well, something happened in history far away, and then it was racist. but I no longer have the capacity to be racist because it's a modern era, it's a new time. So I think that's fake, and I think we have to call it out for what it is.
So what did you think when you saw the cartoon? Did you think straight up that is racist?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think it's really hard to reach any other conclusion. And then if you're operating in good faith and you really didn't know it was racist, and then people called it to your attention and said, oh, well, look at these images, and then you saw that, you wouldn't double down and reprint them. I think you might, if you were operating in good faith, say, oh my goodness, I didn't know that, because that's what I do when I make a mistake. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I referred to you by the wrong pronoun and I will change, right? But he didn't, so they didn't. So there's an ideological war that's going on that has nothing to do with being innocent and everything to do with seeking to offend on purpose.
Andrew, did you see the cartoon?
I did indeed. And,
would you publish it?
And I think this shows that culture wars can come from the left as well as the right.
Yeah.
Indeed, many culture wars were started with the left, not with the right, and the right then responded in the way that it does.
Would you? And
I'm now told I'm not allowed to have an opinion on this. Yes, I would have published it. It's a caricature, and caricatures exaggerate features. It's a caricature of a particular individual. It's not generic, like the Jim Crow cartoons were generic. This is a particular individual, and it captures the appalling strop she had and her behaviour, which on the court was disgraceful. And I don't see what's wrong with that. And it also got the point across that it overshadowed the victory of the woman who'd actually won the Grand Slam.
It wasn't a generic caricature. It was. I mean, it
wasn't a generic.
It was a generic caricature. I mean, 1,000 pictures could have looked like that one. That is the stereotype of what a black woman looks like.
Well, it looked like to me like a caricature of Serena Williams.
It looked like a caricature.
And by the way,
of a black woman is supposed to look like.
was doing caricatures of Condoleezza Rice, none of you complained.
I did.
Well,
let's go across.
Where can I read the complaint?
Let's go across in here from Germaine and David. Start with David.
This is so difficult. I've been reading lots and lots of the angry commentators over the last few days who were deeply disturbed by the cartoon. And we have to pay proper attention to the fact that that cartoon caused distress, and particularly distress in North America, as well as in Australia. And I'm interested in the fact that almost none of the commentators who are truly furious about that cartoon worried about her performance on the court. And I point that out because people must be asking themselves, naturally asking themselves, why would Mark Knight draw a cartoon like that? Well, if you're not upset by what Serena Williams did on the court, this magnificent, famous athlete behaved appallingly on the court, appallingly. She did a hissy fit, she attempted to bully the umpire, she was appalling. If you think that, that complicates the motives of the cartoonist deeply. If you don't think that, if you think Serena is above criticism and what she did was fine, then surely you would think the only motive for this cartoon is racist. But I think it's much more complicated than that. It is a very tough caricature of a magnificent black woman athlete. And there are people who have seen in those features race hate. I actually think it's a clumsy, brutal caricature, but I think it's publishable, and I think we need to have a very good conversation.
So, David, you're saying essentially that motive makes a difference in matters of race.
No, I'm saying something more complex than that. In attempting to work out the purpose of the cartoon, is this a racist attack? I think you have to look at the circumstances that provoked the cartoon, that there is more to it than this brutal image. And it's a brutal image of a woman having a hissy fit.
Germaine.
We haven't noticed that it's also sexist. We're so caught up in the fact that it's racist in that it gives you a version of a cliche account. In fact, the game was gone already because she dropped the first set and she was looking for a way out. I mean, she's surrounded by people who expected her to win. And I found the way she behaved really repellent, especially when she put her arm around the poor young woman who had actually won the bloody thing, as if to say, you know, I am the grande dame and you've done quite well, dearie, when really what had happened is she'd thrown the match. That's really what the cartoon should have been about. But it wasn't, because it was simply a coarse account of what a woman of Afro-American heritage might look like. That was, as far as I'm concerned, it missed the point. There was a better cartoon in there if he'd thought for another 10 minutes.
So, where was the issue with gender then? I mean, where was this
Her
sexist?
behaviour was clearly unbecoming a woman. We've had plenty of bad behaviour from plenty of...
But you're saying the cartoon was sexist, so I'm just trying to work out where the cartoon was sexist as opposed to racist.
Well, because it made her into a grotesque female figure. Right. And we're used to grotesque female figures.
OK, let's move on. We've got another question from Mimosa Paul.
So when I heard about how Germaine Greer had been dropped from the Brisbane Writers' Festival and about the issue of no platforming, I was saddened because in my daily life, it's increasingly difficult to understand the worldviews of others just because they don't appear on my daily news feed. So what is being done to help young people especially to engage with other worldviews and to navigate them when they're conflicting with their own?
Andrew, this deplatforming notion is taken off. It's in the United States, in Britain, in universities.
And here too.
And here, now.
I mean, you ask what can be done for young people. You have this in your own hands. You're the ones at university now. You're the ones coming out through life. You're the ones that should be fighting for free speech and making sure people like Germaine are not closed down. There should always be a bias in favour of hearing every opinion that is legal, as long as it's not incendiary. Of course, there are limits to freedom. Nobody should stand up now and shout fire, because that could lead to people being injured on the way out. But other than these limits, people should be allowed to express what they want. We have a vested interest in freedom. We should enjoy it. We're a democracy. Many countries of the world are not democracies. And I hate this business, whether it's from the left or from the right, of closing down debate, of only... People's idea now of impartiality is only hearing things they want to hear. Otherwise, you're biased. And I think we need to get back to the old idea of a really good debate and hearing all sides and making up your own mind and not banning people just because you don't want to hear from them or behaving badly. You have an obligation to listen to people. You don't have to agree with them. You can heckle as well. That's pretty good. But not as happened recently. I saw at Sydney University have one of these megaphones and shouting in somebody's ear because you didn't like what she was saying. I think we've gone back on this, not forward. And so I think my generation has let it go too far. It was a question from a young person. The future's in your hands. Don't let yourselves down.
Sisonke.
Yeah, it was hard for me not to heckle and disagree with these two just now about Serena, but I contained myself.
Yeah, very disciplined.
Very disciplined. I'm still working on it. But I think that I could not agree more with this idea. Like, I come from a country, South Africa, where books were banned, where people, where a racist regime said, you will not read this book. So my inclination is typically to want to hear views that people don't want me to hear. I'm a writer. I want to be able to express myself, and I want to hear things that are different from my view. So I was deeply disappointed that Germaine was not on the platform for Brisbane. I think that was a terrible idea. I think there is a difference between finding and accessing views that are different to your own and hearing them, if only so you can argue against them. It makes your arguments tougher and better. But I also think that there's a difference when it comes to people who have had real-life terrible consequences for real people. So I think that becomes a different question. And so I was more skeptical when it came to the question of Steve Bannon, but I was definitely worried about taking Germaine off the platform.
Elena.
Well, firstly, I would just like to clarify what I said earlier about saying, well, no one can say something's racist or not racist. Obviously, I'm not saying that you can't have an opinion, Andrew, and you wouldn't listen to me even if I did, because who am I?
You couldn't stop me anyway.
Exactly. But I guess what I was trying to say before is I suppose we should listen, or we should recognise when some people have greater experience or knowledge in an area. You know, fine, everyone should be free to speak about anything they want to. Everyone should be free to say whatever they want to. I disagree with Germaine being disinvited entirely. I agree with Sisonke there. But we still, you know, this comes down to the issue of experts, you know, and in recent years there's been this discussion around, you know, us not having the respect for experts that we used to have. So there's free speech, everyone can say what they want, but we also need to, you know, just be critical and carefully and intellectually critical of who it is we're listening to and who has the expertise on a particular issue. Now, I would just like to address the fact that your question was about young people. I'm a math teacher, so I don't deliver any humanities curriculum, and my colleagues will hate me if I say we should put more of that into school, you know, because we're
Not really, because you also teach and coach debating.
Yes,
and, if that isn't about opposing ideas, what is?
I'm doing my bit, but, you know, look, our curriculum is incredibly crowded and there's huge debate about what should be in it. You know, it flares up all the time and, you know, the teachers are, you know, sometimes at each other's necks. Well, you know, you're taking the kids out of school for this and this. Yeah. So I think as schools, we have an obligation, you know, to start young. Maybe children are only hearing one side of things from their parents. We have to deliver, you know, balance of ideas in our curriculum as well.
David.
There's nothing new about this. I mean, in the late 1970s, Tony Abbott led a team of roaring boys around Sydney University to stop lesbians being heard at public meetings. I mean, bad behaviour on the campus goes back a long time, and there were lefties doing it and righties doing it, and that kind of bad behaviour was you know, was going on in your day, wasn't it, Germaine? Yes. It was.
I don't think anybody talked about anything in my day.
Except you.
But
what I find example of that.
What I'm trying to get my head around is the new respectability of the notion of deplatforming people. That's what you know, that it's actually a movement and that it has, you know, shutting people up has some kind of high purpose.
Oh, and that it's moved to book festivals.
And it's, moved to book festivals. I mean, if you've got, I mean, how much money have they got to turn down a commercial winner, like, you know, a $10 a head theatre full of people to hear Germaine? You people are getting it free tonight, you'll notice. No, but what... Again, this is being cheaply referred to as a left-right thing, and it wasn't a bunch of lefties that stopped Chelsea Manning coming into the country and speaking the other day. I think this is a young-old thing, and I'm very interested that this question comes from a young person, because I wonder whether the toxic nature of debate on the internet and on blog sites, the way that's controlled at the moment is by blocking people. You try and have an intelligent debate on the internet by blocking people, by blocking the trolls, blocking the idiots who are there. And the notion of blocking seems to have kind of spread out from there into the community itself. And I think this is a terrible development, a really terrible development. And I hope it stops.
Let's hear from Germaine then, because you were the one who was supposedly deprogrammed. I know you don't actually think
That's not the word. Deprogrammed is a completely different thing.
Deplatformed, I'm sorry. You could never deprogram Germaine. And you wouldn't want to. Deplatformed at a number of festivals. Did you feel bad about it? Because in the end you just sort of mushroomed and popped up in 20 other places.
Look, everybody gets so upset about this, but really it's a shadow play. I mean, people are constantly leaping up and down and saying, I mustn't be allowed to speak hither or thither or yon, that they're going to come and break up the meeting. And, you know, the interesting thing is they never show up. That's the thing that gets me. And, you know, so much domestic violence is a matter of empty threat that keeps women in terror. So it just gets me that these people are constantly shaking their fists and saying, we'll come and smash the place up, you won't be allowed to talk. Universities have spent money hiring extra security and they didn't need it. I'm sick and tired of this bullying, because that's really what it is. Now, when we talked about bullying...
Are you saying that the festival organisers were bullied or feared that these things might happen?
What
therefore
was going,
were afraid to have you in the
What's going on in Brisbane is a mystery to anybody except the people who live on Grey Street. Yes.
On a wide front.
I'm not... it hasn't happened that I've been muzzled or prevented from speaking. ever. But I have difficulties with the idea of debate, for example, because at Cambridge and Oxford, the art of debating is to take a point of view which you don't hold and argue it spuriously and theatrically in order to win, which has its own deleterious effect even on debate in the House. People don't say what they really believe, and the way it's going is we don't have time to listen to bullshit and grandstanding and all the rest of it. We really want people to tell us what they honestly think and feel and where the shoe pinches, because we don't necessarily know.
Which is why we love having you on the Q&A program, but we're out of time.
Oh, goody.
So sorry to tell you that. And apologies to the good people of Brisbane. We really do love you. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Andrew Neil, Sisonke Msimang, Elena Jeffcoat, Germaine Greer and David Marr. Thank you. Now, next Monday, I'm sorry to tell you, Q&A will be off air, but we'll be back on Monday, the 1st of October, with plenty to discuss and debate. Joining us on the panel live from Melbourne, then, some politicians, a People's Panellist, a musician with something to say and sing, John Butler of the John Butler Trio. Until then, good night.